The Bedroom Producing Podcast, Season 1, Episode 4. Welcome to the Bedroom Producing Podcast. If you're a bedroom producer and you want to release tracks, perfect your workflow, or explore a new creative process, then this is the podcast for you. Today's guest is artist Digo, also known as Daniel Goldstein, out of New Orleans. Daniel and I discuss some of the subtleties of the future-based genre, recruiting vocalists for your track, and tips for planning your album artwork. Digo, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.
100%. Thanks for making the time to be here, man.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to get into your creative process and want to talk about some of the different projects that you're working on as well. But before we do that, can you tell me a little bit about your musical background and how you got into being a bedroom producer?
I come from a family where music is kind of a must. My mom was pretty adamant that, like, you know, you got to play an instrument when you're growing up. That was important. So my brother and my sister both did, and she kind of put me on that same path when I was in kindergarten. When I was like 5 years old, she started me on piano lessons, and I hated it. I probably took like 2 lessons. But then she was like, no, you have to pick an instrument. So I was like, all right. And eventually I picked drums a couple years later. Played drums for probably 5 or 6 years. And then I fell off a little bit in terms of music. But in high school, we had this like electronic like music production class. So I took that when I was a junior. But I knew like literally nothing. Oh, so I should clarify. I should step back. When my family got like an iMac when I was growing up, and so I would like arrange loops together, and I was like, yeah, this is cool.
Yeah.
Had no idea what I was doing. So when I came into that class, I still had no idea. I didn't know what like chords were. Like I had no idea.
Yeah.
I was a drummer, right? I was all rhythmic. It was nothing.
I feel your pain. Pain. I'm a drummer too.
So I was like, damn, I know nothing. And so I borrowed my neighbor's keyboard and I got on YouTube and just started kind of learning piano and trying to learn all that stuff. Took that class for a couple of years, and then I took a year off between high school and college, and I got an audio engineering certificate out in Ohio.
Oh, cool. Where in Ohio?
Chillicothe, Ohio.
Oh, yeah. I live in Columbus.
So
cool.
Yeah. So at the recording workshop, if you're familiar, everyone who goes to Capitol actually has to go there as part of their engineering degree. So that was tight.
Oh, fantastic. I need to check that out.
Yeah. So it's cool. And so I did that, and then took 1 semester of theory in college and just kind of met people in college. One guy in particular, my freshman year, who really helped like mentor me. He was signed on a label when I met him. So he was doing school and doing some music at the same time. So he really helped me, show me the ropes of Logic, which is the software I use. And I just sort of have developed through there, watching a lot of YouTube tutorials, just talking to folks, getting to know producers, and, you know, collaborating and all that good stuff, and just kind of working on my craft.
I love it, man. I love it.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, do you have any favorite YouTube channels you can recommend for the audience?
I love Synth Hacker. He does sound design tutorials for Serum mostly.
Cool.
Like Serum and Massive, I think, are the two. He's great. It's like really simple, straightforward. He does great recreations of the sounds. And that's been really big for me, because like whether or not I like the actual sound he's going for, the techniques he uses to get there, I'm like, oh, let me try this next time. And so I just learned synth way better. You know, I was just able to, like, if I now want to make my own sound, I'm like, oh, I have this idea in my head. I'm like, oh, well, you know, I learned these strategies from watching his videos. So yeah, he's awesome.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Synth Hacker.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great, man.
ADSR, like Echo Soundworks, that kind of stuff. There's one that's like Logic, like why Logic Pro rules if you're a Logic user, because he really gets into like the details of like what that software can do, because it is so insanely powerful. I don't even know, like I'm probably halfway into the software at this point, and I've been using it for 6 years, right? And so I'm like, I'm learning new stuff. There's an Instagram. Let me actually pull this guy up, because he should get a shout out. Logic_tips on Instagram.
Cool.
Excellent stuff. Really just helps me out.
Tips and tricks for Logic.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Just short form, like, hey, did you know Logic can do this? And I'm like,
Yeah.
no, I didn't. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's one thing about Logic. So I've dabbled in Logic. I'm mostly an Ableton guy myself.
Yeah.
But Logic is insanely powerful. There's a lot of little things that are kind of under the hood.
Yeah.
That are not necessarily intuitive that you can do with it, I've noticed.
Yes.
And so you got to kind of know where to look. I think that there is a higher learning curve with that software personally.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of different things that you can do with it too.
Yeah. And I went to Logic because I started out just like arranging loops on GarageBand. And so it was a pretty natural progression for me.
Yeah.
And I don't know, had I known a little bit more about production and like I didn't get into electronic music until I was in college. So I'd already started kind of producing before that. Had I been leaning towards electronic music before, maybe I would have gone with Ableton earlier on. But I think to this point, I've learned Logic well enough that I can pretty much do anything in Logic that, I mean, I know Ableton's probably a little bit easier to use. It's a little bit kind of more upfront on that production end, but
I think it is.
Yeah, I think eventually once you learn these little tips and tricks in Logic, you can really do the same stuff, which is great.
Yeah. I think you can absolutely be successful in either one of them or a different DAW if that's what you want to use. I think it's kind of about your workflow. What's going to work for you, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, as long as you're comfortable and you can make the music you want to make, like just it doesn't really matter. So
yeah, I used to have a friend. He would say, if the song is good, you win.
Yeah, right.
That's very true, Craig.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you didn't get into electronic music till you were like in college. Can you tell me about some of the different artists who have inspired you or different tracks that have inspired you?
Yeah. So I'm from Boston originally. We don't really have like a festival culture much up there, or at least we didn't. Boston Calling has grown like so much in the past like 3 or 4 years even. But yeah, it just wasn't really something I was a part of, and we didn't really have much of. But yeah, I came here and I heard, do you know, Feel Good? It's Illenium, Griffin, and Dea.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And I was like, this is cool.
Cool.
And then Illenium actually was coming to play at Voodoo Fest down here in New Orleans, which is this like Halloween themed, like big festival. And I went and I saw him live and I was like, this is crazy. Like, this is what I want to do. And I was like, yeah. And so it was just this really crazy experience where I like didn't know any of his stuff. And it was like that and his Say It remix, of the Flume and Tove Lo song.
Cool. I don't know. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, that one's a classic. That's such a, I don't know. I can listen to that remix at any point. that was, I think, what really brought him up. But I also got really into San Holo.
Oh yeah, yeah. He's
his
a really
next
cool
episode
artist.
remix. It's I think that one's still such a great remix. And so I've kind of followed him as he's transferred from that more like trap oriented, like future bass stuff into his more kind of acoustic, nostalgic element. Porter Robinson with Worlds and his most recent release, it's just been on repeat for me.
That's awesome.
Duskus, who's also on Bitbird, if you're familiar, Tosca Black. Yeah. I'm a big Bitbird fan, which is San Holo's label, but
no, that's great, man. You find something that's kind of in the vein that you like, and you might find other artists that are related. You know, an artist I'm a huge fan of is Closey, and then I've kind of found some of the other artists that seem to collab with her and stuff, and found some really interesting work that I like. So you mentioned future bass, and you seem to have a lot of inspiration from sort of the future bass circuit. How would you describe your music? Is that what you would describe it as?
Yeah, I mean, I think future bass is probably the most, it's like the closest to it, but also, I mean, like I also wouldn't say that I've like found a consistent sound yet. I mean, which you may have noticed just kind of listening to some of the different songs on there. I think I'm very much still in a point where I'm like, I'll hear a song or two and I'm like, oh, that's so cool. And so I'll try to emulate that with my next track. And so things will come out very differently. So like with Crashing or Surrender, which are two of my more recent songs, it's much more in that sort of like future bass. And then there was most recent one I put out is like instrumental, which is inspired by this like whole other playlist of like different artists that I've been listening to.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's still shifting, but it's hard to maybe put everything into one genre comfortably. But
I think that, well, a lot of artists play across different genres, and the genre can't necessarily encompass everything that you do.
Right.
But I think it's helpful to give listeners an idea, so especially if we have maybe some other people that are DJing and things out there, and they're looking for some future bass tracks, and we can kind of point them in this direction for sure.
I would say I'm more comfortable saying like, okay, it's not house, it's not like trance or techno, is right. It's definitely not in that vein,
right?
Definitely more in that sort of future bass leaning area, a little bit more in that electro pop kind of sense too.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. Actually, what do you think?
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the elements that help define, and it doesn't have to be just future bass, but let's separate it from techno and house. What do you think are some of the elements that make it different?
So I think one of the biggest ones that like house and like house particularly, like a 4 on the floor beat is crucial, right? You have your pretty standard kick, your snare, those sort of syncopated hats, rides, whatever you might want to use there. Whereas future bass has a little bit more of it's not 4 on the floor. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but I would say
it's halftime a lot of the time, isn't it? Right? Like the snare is going to be on beat 3 a lot of the time, right? Instead of beat 2 and 4.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that. It's just a little bit more like the kicks are, you're solid on 1, but then it's like, okay, you'll probably have your kick and then another kick, like, just before your snare. So that sort of rhythm is pretty big. And if you look like on YouTube at the channels that do like how to make a song like this artist, they'd be like, oh, classic future bass beat, and then it'll be like pretty simple, pretty straightforward.
It's a great tip for people that want to get started in the genre for sure.
Those are excellent. Yeah, I think. I mean, even I don't always love the end results that those kinds of channels come up with, but it definitely does give you a pretty solid sense of like, big chords. This is your sort of general future bass type beat, and then you can play with that and kind of adapt it how you want to adapt it.
The broad strokes.
Just
how to make a future bass beat. Go on to YouTube. It's a great idea.
I mean, like heavy sidechain on your chords. I think eighth notes are really, really big, like eighth note, like super saws, or like if you're going for that kind of bigger sound that's maybe a little bit more towards melodic dubstep, it's like big, just like wall of sound, like chords. It's usually one of those two. So there's
I like that.
A few different elements.
That thought process too. You talk about melodic dubstep, right? And I see that a lot in future bass, and I think future bass is very related to dubstep too, like kind of the pacing of it. But I would say, from what I hear, I kind of think of it as a brighter sound or a bouncier sound a lot of the time. And that sidechain compression is absolutely important, I think, because it does help create the bounce in the track, right? Yeah,
it's crucial. I mean, it's crucial, I think, mix wise, because electronic music is so like kick focused. Like you wouldn't mix like a jazz song and an electronic music song the same way, because like the presence of your kick is like the absolute key to your drop, your chorus, whatever you want to call it. So that sidechain is like stylistic. It's like a mix technique. It's all of that stuff. But that's crucial.
Talk to me a little bit about finding the right kick or developing the right kick for your track.
That's tough. So I'm on Splice. I think a lot of people who listen probably are familiar with Splice. I've been using it for a number of years now. It's where I get like all of my drum samples, some more like melodic hits and stuff. like impacts, effects, all that good stuff.
Love it.
And
so you just kind of circle through and look for one, or do you?
Well, yeah, and I do actually have a few. So this friend of mine who was he was signed to a label at the time, and now he's like a songwriter and producer actually out in LA. But he gave me a couple of things. He gave me like a couple of kicks that are his like go-tos. Because what you want, at least for what I'm looking for, is something that has enough high end, at least in your drop, like frequency wise, high end to sort of help punch through. If you don't have that, you might have to have a top kick or something. But you need both. You need enough low end to really like hit in the chest on a good system, but enough high end to like peek through and really kind of punch. But you don't want something super long and boomy, because then that'll just get in the way of like your bass and your other elements. So you want something fairly short, but pretty hard hitting when it's there. And I think that helps with the sidechain too, is that you can really just hit it pretty quickly, and then it, yeah. So I do kind of lean on this. Probably mostly I found success with this one kick sample that he passed off to me, but it often has to be adjusted a little bit. I might have to saturate it or EQ it or compress it depending on the song. So
cool. Do you have any favorite plugins that you tend towards for favorite compressors, EQs, saturators?
Yeah. So I like Fab Filter's stuff. I'm on Pro Q2. I'm not on Pro Q3 yet. I would love to, just for that dynamic mode. The dynamic EQ that they've got built in. But Pro Q2 is just really great. I think it's easy to use. It's got it's just pretty straightforward. It doesn't use a ton of CPU, which is awesome because I'm on a mid 2014 MacBook with a crappy processor.
Yeah. I just recently retired my 2011 MacBook Pro. So okay. I feel you, man. I just kept upgrading it. Yeah. And then Apple was like, we're not going to let you upgrade anymore. You're just going to bake everything in. So
I know. Yeah. It's been something, it's been a point of a little bit of problem for me recently, is that I have to freeze my track so much, especially with Serum and all these other kind of high CPU usage things. It's like, oh man, it slows the workflow down, which is not ideal. But Pro Q is really good, honestly, for most of my compressors. So the Wave stock stuff's pretty good. There's one free one from this company called Klanghelm. It's their like MUJC, something like that. So
you said you like the Fab Filter plugins, and then you said Waves, and then what was the other one?
It's called Klanghelm, like
Klanghelm,
Klang Helm. They make a vocal compressor. There's like a paid version, but also a free version, and it's excellent. It, I think, competes really, or sometimes outperforms some of the paid stuff. So I highly recommend that.
Cool. I gotta check that out.
Yeah.
Check out Klanghelm. Love it, man. Love it.
Super simple, 2 knobs, right? It's like, it's great.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I love that. So sometimes it can be fun to experiment like that. So I like both ways. I like having a plugin where I know everything that's going on, so I can really tweak all the different parameters. Yeah. But on the other hand, sometimes it can be interesting to explore with a plugin that only has a couple of knobs. Yeah. And you are forced to listen and just you don't know exactly what it's doing under the hood. Right. Do you like it better or don't you, is the question.
Exactly. Yeah. It's got, it's like, you've got your compression amount and makeup, and then there's like fast, slow, and auto. There's a switch for that. And it's like, all right, well, like, just see if it sounds good. And, it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, does this sound better than me tweaking a bunch of things? It's like, well, if it sounds better, I'm just going to go with that. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just going to do it. So,
yeah. I think the only thing that I like to really be careful of if I'm looking at something like that is it making it louder? Yeah. Because you always have to be conscious. If something's making it louder, it's going to kind of subconsciously make you think it's better, and it's just louder, right?
Right. The importance of gain staging.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, that's where I think you have to really develop your ear with compression. Is like the really important thing is like, okay, are we sort of hitting the same levels of loudness?
Mm-hmm.
It does it sound better because it's louder, or if once I'm using that makeup knob correctly, are we actually at the same level? And I really like where the compression is. So
yeah, 100%.
That's a big skill
Yeah,
to develop.
Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about your creative process? How do you get started on a track?
Yeah. Usually it's with chords. I like to take either a piano sound or a fairly simple like synth sound. And when I was in school, I had access to like upright grand pianos pretty regularly. And so I would just kind of go and mess around and, you know, try different progressions, different inversions, stuff like that. And just kind of find something that spoke to me progression wise.
Do you have any particular resources you like to use do you stick to what are popular power progressions? Do you use other tracks for inspiration and progressions, or you just kind of have a few chords that you know and you kind of feel it out?
Yeah, I mean, I have a general, I think now by this point I have kind of a general sense of like just chords, and I just use my own ear of like, does this sound good? And it's like at a certain point, I mean, I definitely was earlier on picking like I have progressions that I wrote down on my phone. There's a YouTube creator that I'm a big fan of named Dylan Tallchief. He's like, you know, Dutch or something, like all electronic music producers are.
Cool. Yeah,
and he did this song, he did a whole video. It was like early on. This was probably like 4 years ago or something, called, he did like how to X artist, and it was for San Holo. And he was like, yeah, so there are a couple of different progressions. And I was like, oh, cool. So awesome. I tried them out, and it was like a pretty successful way to get that sound sort of without it just feeling like a carbon copy, right? It wasn't just like a straight like pop progression.
Yeah.
For me, sometimes it's like, I'm like trying to come up with something cool and new and interesting. And I'm like, damn, like there are some progressions that just sound good. Right. And it's a question of what is my sound design? How am I doing this rhythmically? And like, what's my melody sound like? Or like a vocal, right? A strong vocal, like crashing isn't like a crazy chord progression or anything. It's just like, I had a good vocal on top of it. And so it doesn't make you feel, you don't feel like you're listening to like a pop song, even though like that's pretty much the chord progression, because there's just other things going on that you can like listen to and feel like, oh, cool, like this is what I'm listening to, right? So
yeah, I think 100%. I mean, it's fine to borrow basic chord progressions. I mean, they're so universal. I mean, you can go on a YouTube and you can hear, they have like YouTube videos where it's 100 songs that use the same chord progression. The songs don't sound anything alike. You know, everybody's going to bring their own thing to the table. And it's like, how are you going to do it rhythmically? How are you going to orchestrate it? How are you going to divide the song sections? What's your vocal like? You know,
and I think learning about extensions too is a thing that can totally change the flavor of like, is this a straightforward like down the middle pop song, or are we doing some like somewhat, I mean, more interesting, let's call it, but like, and I think that to go back to your earlier question, like one of the things that I think is really important in future bass is using extensions, right? Getting up into like, you have your triad, but you have sevenths and ninths, and then like different inversions that sort of, I like to sort of build melodies into the chord progressions to a degree, especially with those kind of like top and middle notes, that those are things that sort of lead you. So instead of it, you know, you can play like C, G, F, whatever, but you have a few extensions, a few other notes in there, and all of a sudden you've sort of created a whole new attitude or flavor of what the song actually sounds like. Yeah,
it totally changes the flavor. I absolutely agree. Yeah. So looking at that, I understand the concept of, you know, kind of starting with a chord progression, but then writing the melody sort of at the same time. Do you like to kind of block that out on a piano first, or do you dive straight into the different instruments?
I don't know. It depends. For the most recent song I put out, there was a different YouTube channel that I found I did like a tutorial of one of their sounds, and I was just playing around with the sound because it was this really sort of like lo-fi piano type sound.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like, I was like, oh, this is just kind of a cool sound. And then I took a progression and put it in there, and that was very much the central element of the song, and everything was just like built around that. But like, yeah, I mean, Crashing is just like a piano,
Yeah.
and it just got built around that.
Yeah. That's like a really great tip that you just gave, though, for someone who's stuck. I just think about it. You're like, okay, because you did a creative process. That's a process. That's a workflow right there that you actually talked about.
Right.
You took a YouTube tutorial, and everybody knows there's a zillion and one YouTube tutorials out there, but you took that and then you combined it with your own chord progression or chord progression you got from somewhere else. So you put the two things together, and then that was a creative element that led into the process. And so was that for Crashing? Was that how you mentioned Crashing, or was that a different track?
So the one for the sound design tutorial was Edenborn, which is the most recent one. Came out in March. Yeah, that was for that. It was like I took the sound and then I tweaked it a little bit because I was like, there were parts of it that I wasn't a big fan of, so I just adjusted it. And I was like, oh, this is kind of a cool progression that I had come up with. And I was like, yeah, that's the central element of my song.
Got it.
Crashing is just a piano. I mean, the intro it's just a piano. It's like a contact library sound or something. So,
and a lot of the time, the best songs have a lot of simple elements in them.
Yeah,
you know.
There's nothing insane in that song. There's nothing like super. I don't know. There's some interesting sounds, I think, but like other than that, it's like a pretty straightforward song. It's a well-written vocal, well performed, and you got a whole song. So
yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit more. You know, for our listeners, the tracks that we're talking about. So we're talking about Edenborn, and then we're now talking about Crashing.
Yes.
And you can find these on Spotify under Digo. It's just Digo. So if you want to pause and listen to the track and come back with us, so we talk a little bit more about the design of these tracks. But so Crashing in particular is one of your more popular ones right now. My
most streamed song ever, actually.
yeah it's a great track. I mean, it's one of those ones you listen to it a couple of times, it sticks in your head. So it's absolutely got a ton of potential. What was the inspiration for this track?
So this was, I think I started this like right before COVID last year, so it was probably like early March of 2020. I was just kind of messing around. I was in school, and producing was very much like a creative break for me. It's just a nice way to sort of process and decompress, I guess. And it sort of started right around COVID as people were starting to get a little bit nervous. And then, very quickly it became like, all right, well, we're off school for 2 weeks and we're all just going to like sit at home because it's dangerous to go outside And so I just kind of dove right into that. I sort of put all that energy of like uncertainty and anxiety and all the just kind of being uncomfortable and just kind of hold up and really put my mind into that. And I don't write intentionally to like get an emotion out. I feel like when I try to get an emotion out, either lyrically or chord progression wise, I end up with something that just feels kind of insincere. But I was just making a song. I was just going, and like that's what came out of it. That was the progression. Just
being in the moment, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah, I guess so. I think making music, like making any art, I think can be kind of meditative in the sense that you're not super active, right? Your brain isn't like fully processing each element in a very active way. Some of it, when you get to a point where you know how to use your software and you know enough about music theory to write, it's just it just kind of goes. And I think that's just kind of what came out of it. And I was found a cool, the drop of both of the songs, two of the songs I put out more recently, Crashing and Surrender, both actually feature the same lead sound as like the main like plucked lead in the drop. It's this like pan flute sound that I found on Splice, and I sampled it. and I love it. I think it sounds so great.
It does.
But I was really
Yeah.
inspired by that, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, this is like the perfect pluck sound because it's natural enough, because it's not super synthetic. It's not super synthesized, I guess I should say, but I found it was the combination of that and like this new sound. I was like, oh, this is awesome. And so I just kind of, went through and I put that instrumental together fairly quickly. And then I put it out to this like music club group on campus that me and Libby, who wrote the song and sang it, she and I were co-presidents of the club at the time. And I put it in that group and I was like, hey, singers, send me demos. And I had probably 7 or 8 people send me demos. I liked hers the most, and she and I had known each other for a couple of years, and it was like a cool thing to be able to collaborate with her finally and make something
that's awesome,
that we both felt really good about. Yeah,
that's awesome. So did you have the entire arrangement at that point? Do you have the drop, the breakdown, like the main structure several minutes long, or did you just have? Okay.
Yeah, it was, I think the only thing that wasn't, there were like 2 things that weren't really fleshed out. It was like the bridge was just the chords, which it mostly is still, I think. But it wasn't like fleshed out. It was just like, I don't really know what to do here. Mm-hmm. So I just put the chords so that there was the structure of like 8 bars of a bridge or 16 bars or however many bars it is. And I hadn't done anything to sort of change each drop. So it was like the first one just repeated twice, which I went back later and sort of changed little things here and there just to keep, each verse has to be a little bit different. So, taking out an element in the first one that is in the second and third, or like a pause somewhere you don't expect it. Like that very last drop is like her saying, when she says crashing, right, that first like word, there's no instruments, and then they come back in, and it's like just that kind of stuff wasn't in there, those sorts of details. But yeah, the whole song was structured out,
awesome,
so she could write to it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things is you sent it out, so you got a pool of demos, so you were able to pick the one that you liked the best out of those.
Yes.
Yeah. Did they do full track demos, or they just kind of submit like a few bars?
Yeah, a couple of singers got full songs to me pretty quickly. A couple singers just had like a hook or like pre-chorus and a hook. And I just got to, it was cool. I got to pick from a few different options.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's awesome. Yeah. I guess it even gives you the potential if you wanted to do a couple of different mix downs, or maybe even like a couple of different tracks, or different things. But it's a lot.
Yeah,
it's a lot.
Well, and it was the first time I had that opportunity. It was the first time I had like collaborated with a singer on a song and like had multiple, and it was just like all of a sudden.
Is that the first time you've collaborated with a singer on a song? Wow,
yeah, that was the first time.
Really impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I had done an instrumental before. I had done mostly like remixes that I released on SoundCloud. And then it was like I did an instrumental track, and then I did a song that I sang. And then it was like, I really need to work with like an actual singer and songwriter. And it was, and now I've done it twice, and I'm working on a third one.
That's fantastic.
The past year or so. So that's cool.
That's fantastic. Now, did she just give you stems for that, basically?
Yeah, so I kind of coached her through. She didn't really know how to record, and we were in different parts of the country. Yeah, so we like, got on Zoom, and I sort of like showed her the ropes a little bit of how to record, and I was like, okay, I want you to just record a few versions of verse 1, and then a few versions of verse 2, whatever. And so she sent me those stems. I comped them together and did the whole thing, and just
So do you know what environment she recorded in?
Her basement.
That's why I asked. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So did she do anything in particular to create like a makeshift vocal booth or help control the sound?
I don't think so. I think I might have been like, oh, maybe if you can find no, I don't actually think so. Yeah, I think it was just, since it was a basement, I think there was carpet, and so I think it was just a little bit dampened by that, but I sort of had to work with what I had in terms of like the natural reverb of the room. Yeah,
that's really cool. Yeah, it worked out really well, I would say.
It turned out a lot better than I was expecting it to. I was really quite happy about it for the most part. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, for sure.
So
Well, I hope some of the DJs out there that might be listening to the podcast will pick up that track crashing.
yeah, by
I've
all means.
I'd heard I'd heard one of my mentors say once that DJs can play tracks, but if you really want to be something special, you need to break tracks. Meaning
Mm,
you need to be the person that gives them something new, gives the
yeah,
people something new, and they come to you at the end of the night and they're like, What's that track you kept playing?"
yeah, yeah.
Uh, to me, crashing could be one of those tracks. So I hope some of the people
Oh,
out there that
thank you.
like future bass might check that one out for sure.
Yeah, I hope so. That'd be great.
So going back to just the creative process,
Yeah.
what do you think are some of the concepts that make a good hook?
It's a great question. So I mean, I think this is like a pretty standard answer. I don't think I'm gonna like tell anyone something totally new here, but like you need to find the balance of like repeatability with just enough variation to keep it interesting. So you want it repetitive enough that it like sticks and that it like sits in people's heads and kind of mulls, but you want it if it's a small rhythmic variation, like if you have the same hook and it's like the same melody, for example, like 3 times or 4 times through, like maybe the first two can be the same, but the third is fairly different. The fourth sort of returns to that first two, but with a small variation there too. But it's yeah, this isn't like the most concrete answer, but like you do need to find a little bit of a balance between like repeating something that's fairly simple enough that people will remember it, just even if they're like not listening super actively, but different enough that when people are really engaging with it and listening to it, there are enough little changes and differences that they go, oh cool, like that was interesting, that was new. Right, like a note being just saying higher in the same, otherwise the same melody is like a big, just even something that small, I think can make a big difference. So
Yeah. No, I think that's a great answer, man. I think that's
yeah.
a fantastic answer. Do you have any favorite synthesizers you like to work with?
So yeah, my go-to is Serum at the
Yeah.
moment. I really like it because I was on Silence first,
Hmm.
but it just, for me, it wasn't very intuitive to learn. I didn't feel like when I adjusted parameters and knobs that I could really tell what I was doing. And so I didn't learn kind of the repeatability of like, okay, when I do this, this changes. I know that for next time. I know what it's doing. I know how it's going to sound. Serum's visual element for me is just, it was really a kind of a game changer in terms of, I was like, okay, when I connect this LFO here and I adjust this parameter, it changes that. I'm like, okay, I can hear that difference and I understand what I'm doing. And so my sound design just like jumped big time because I was actually able to figure out like what I was doing and how to do it consistently. And that was big.
Yeah, that's a great point. That synth does have a ton of visual feedback, which can be
Yeah.
really helpful when you're
Yeah,
doing sound design. Yeah.
totally.
Do you work entirely like in the box on your computer, or do you have like hardware or anything that you like to use too?
I recently picked up my first hardware synth earlier this year,
Yeah.
which is a Casio SK1.
Cool.
It's a sampling synth from the mid 80s.
Yeah. That's old school stuff, right?
That's old school. Yeah, the big feature for me is the sampling thing. I mean, I love the flute sound on it. It's a pretty simple like sine wave like flute. And I'm trying to make some songs with that to sort of varying degrees of success. But yeah, it's a really cool synth. I'm mostly in the box, but once I'm a little bit more established in terms of like where I live and with some income, I'd love to get some more hardware going too.
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's cool. That's cool that you're exploring with the actual real world synthesizer too, though.
yeah, yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned trying to find some stability in your life right
Mm.
now. How do you balance, work, life, and being an artist and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been I think it kind of comes in cycles, and that's generally how creativity is for me. I'm definitely, I think, more recently on a bit of a downswing. I haven't really gotten into my DAW to be like creative as much recently. Part of that has just been busy. I've been busy with work. Part of it is like, the past probably month or so, I recorded with an artist, and so that's not so as much of a creative process as producing, right? I'm like comping vocals and automating the levels, and then I'm gonna have to go in and do all the processing. I got a mixing client, which mixing is its own kind of creative process in a way, but it's also more like they have something that they want, and I'm just trying to make it happen. But I don't know. I mean, it can be tough. I think you have to be intentional about making time for it. Because when Crashing came out, I mean, all 3 songs that I've put out since September of last year have come while I've been working. And so you got to be intentional about, well, first of all, things are just going to go kind of slowly. I think you just got to be a little bit patient and not rush things, because you don't want to get caught without the things you need. So I was like, I really want to make sure I have good album artwork in order, and maybe like a canvas for Spotify and a little bit of like a promo plan for social media. Like, okay, I'm going to look through hashtags that are popular, right? So you do all that stuff ahead of time. And that can be on your lunch break, or it can be after work. It can be, just trying to use that free time intentionally to do all the little things. If that's something you want to do. I mean, I know a lot of people are just making music just for fun, but if you also want to promote it, you have to be intentional about creating a little bit of a schedule and creating some graphics or getting some pictures taken by a friend or whatever, just to have something to post. And yeah, so it's tough, but
yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, yeah, a lot goes into releasing a track like that. What you mentioned the album art. What resources do you like to use for album art?
Canva. Is, I think, the big free one that a lot of people know about. I've tried to use photos either that I've taken or actually, so with Surrender that came out in January, I was really fortunate because the singer I worked with on that is also a graphic designer. Nice. So she did the album art. Yeah, it was really cool. Yeah, that was really, I was like, oh, this is huge, right? She did some promo materials. She did the album art, and I was like, yeah, that's sick. My most recent song, I actually have a coworker from home who's also a photographer. So I was like, I've had my eye on her Instagram for a little while for album art, and then I just sort of like went through it and found something that I really liked. That's another thing I would just, as a random tip for anyone out there, like make friends with artists who do other types of art. Cause you can exchange with them or pay them or whatever it is, like however you want to do it. Sometimes they'll just do it because you're friends, as long as you tag them and get the exposure, I guess. But it's like, I'm friends with a really good photographer, and even a different one who's in New Orleans, and we've done some stuff together. One of my housemates does animation and visual art. She did my most recent canvas. So yeah, and then other than that, it's like I'll take my own pictures sometimes or have a friend take a picture for album art. But it's definitely helpful to have people who don't just have like Canva, but like can really get into that more advanced stuff and really get you some cool results.
Yeah, that's great tips, man. I love that. Just networking with other artists from other mediums is a way of trying to find something.
That's big.
Yeah. So how about this? Can you tell me something that you wish you had known when you first started producing?
I think really just to just create stuff. It doesn't have to be good. And I think you'll get probably the same answer from any producer you talk to. I was watching an interview with Porter Robinson recently about his newest album, where even he was saying this, like most of the projects you make are probably gonna not be good, and that's fine. Like that's cool, no problem. As long as you're sort of just getting out there and like trying new things and being creative and just like taking risks. Because I think I was worried early on about like, oh, well, if I try this, like it might not sound good. It's like, who cares? It's in your DAW. No one has to hear it, you know? You can make a project. It can suck and you'll learn from that. And that's awesome. And you can move and like, oh, maybe you hated the song, but you liked one sound that you made. So you can save that and use it in a different song. Or you liked the chord progression or a sample that you got. You liked it, but you didn't like how you flipped it this time. That's totally cool. Just, I think the important thing is like the more you create, the more you kind of learn about your own process and eventually eventually something will stick, right? Like eventually something will, you will find something you're like, oh, this is awesome. This is really cool. I really like this. And you'll feel good about it and you can release it if that's what you want to do. You can just listen to it yourself because you like it. I mean, whatever it is. But yeah, just going out there. And I think the other thing is like, you can always hit Command Z. It's a computer, right?
Yeah.
You can just undo it. Like it's not a big deal. It's not tape. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Can you imagine working on tape?
Oh my God. No, I really can't. Cause I was doing vocal automations for this mix that I'm working on. And I was literally thinking about that. I was like, I have no idea how people did this in the past. Cause I'm out there like, I'll bring it up 5 decibels or 4 decibels. And I'm like, nah, that was too much. I'm like, okay, 2.2. And I'm like, I can just go back and do that. Like that's easy.
Yeah. So, I can't imagine. It's a different world.
Big time.
Yeah. Time. So, tell me, you've played live a little bit. What would your dream gig be? I think like a festival main stage has to be it, I just think that idea, that like sort of look of like, I don't know, there's sort of two sides of it, right? Where I think like a festival main stage would be so sick because it's like, you got like fire and you have lights and you have all these sick graphics going on. You got like, thousands of people going hard to your music or whatever you mix. And you're like, that seems incredible. But I also think at the same time, like one of the things I really enjoyed about DJing like house parties in college is that like you're all just kind of packed in there and you're really in that energy. Like people are like when you do it like a smooth transition from one song to another and like you're like, oh, I picked a song like people haven't heard in a while, like, but I think they're gonna like it. And then like 25 people in the room are like, oh my God, that's so cool. And they just start going crazy. You're like, that's the coolest feeling. Cause you're right there and you're like, you're moving that party forward and, responsible for people having a good time. And it's really cool. It's 100%. That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Yeah. Playing any kind of a small venue does have that appeal to it. We're just in there in the moment. And
people can come up to you and be like, yo, this is so cool. Like, that's a great song. Like, oh, you're doing a good job. And I'm like, cool. you really get that. Yeah. You get that validation like right there. And you're like, that's it. That feels good.
Yeah. That's awesome. All right, man. Well, I've got just a couple more questions that I would like to wrap up with here.
For sure.
So something I like to ask everyone is, imagine that you're producing a track and you've got sort of a concept, 8 or 16 bars. You've got something going, but then you kind of get stuck.
Yes.
What do you like to do to progress from that point forward?
2 things. Because first of all, this happens all the time. I mean, I think this is like a very universal experience of like finding an 8 or 16 bar loop that you're like, oh, this sounds so cool. Like, this is awesome. And then you're like, all right, well, what next? Like, where do I go? But I think it kind of speaks to the last tip. It's like, try some stuff out after. Well, okay. So 2 things. First of all, take a break, right? Just take some time, even like a couple hours, a couple of days, just like come back to it. Cause you never know like what you'll hear with fresh ears. You might be like, oh, it'd be cool if I went here, or it'd be cool if like this leads into this part that I have. Cause I've had times where I'm like, oh yeah, here's this cool verse I made. And I'm like, oh no, this is the drop. Like I can actually make something that leads into this and makes this much bigger and more powerful. And I'm like, cool. Okay. and that only happens once you give yourself space. Because if you just keep pushing, sometimes it just gets kind of stale and it stagnates and you don't get anywhere. So take a break. That's one thing. It's also good for your ears. So take a break.
Yeah.
And the other thing is like, you can just undo stuff if it doesn't sound good. So just try something new, right? Just like be like, okay, what about this chord progression? What about, because a lot of the time it's like, okay, it can be hard to transition out of a drop into the next verse. So just try something. Do I want to go like straight from drop into verse? Do I want to have like a little 2 or 4 bar like kind of breakdown where things fall and then kind of come back up? And it's like, all right, cool. I can try both of those out. And like worst case, I just delete it. That's fine. It's cool. Just try something new.
I love that, man.
Yeah.
Take a break. Explore. Go ahead.
Yeah. And listen, I think one of the really biggest things too is listen to music you like. Like what are they doing? Right? What is that? You don't have to copy them, exactly, but I'm like, okay, when you transition from a drop straight into a verse, how do you do it? Okay, you cut out the drums in the last bar. There's a riser and then it goes into, right? So it's like just listening a little bit more analytically to like the music that you kind of stylistically want to emulate. You can be like, oh, that's a really cool idea. Maybe I'll put a fill here. Maybe I'll, do a filter sweep or something like that, just to be like, oh, that's how you moved. And that's how you got out of that, that loop that you were in, right? Those 16 bars are so cool. Like this is a way that I can transition and just make it move a little bit.
Yeah. Solid, man. Those are so good. Such good tips. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting producing electronic music?
Listen to a lot of music. Just
it's a good idea.
Kind of the same thing. You're going to have to build, I think, an analytical ear. Because ultimately, and people don't love hearing this, but you're never going to come up with something totally original, right? Everything you come up with is going to be sort of your version of other things you hear, right? You like bits and pieces of this song and that song, whatever. And through the lens of you and your brain and your experiences, you're going to create something new, but you have to listen to other stuff first to get there. You're not going to pull it out of thin air. So find some artists you like, find some stuff that you sort of want to emulate kind of. And as you do that, you'll kind of build your skills and you'll build just sort of the knowledge of like how these songs work. And then once you get that down, you can kind of play with it and make new stuff. The other thing is just like get on YouTube, like look up tutorials. If you want to know how to sound like this artist or how to do this or I think YouTube is like one of the most insane resources on the planet because you can find a tutorial for anything you want and it's free.
It's so true. It's so true. It's crazy. Yeah, it's
unreal. And that friend of mine he's a professional producer and songwriter. Like he's gotten songs signed to like Sony and Columbia and like really big stuff. It's like he's always on YouTube. He's like, yeah, dude, just get on YouTube. Like, I have a PhD from YouTube University. I'm like, yeah.
That's great. I love it.
It's a great resource. I think it's so underrated and I would highly recommend it.
That's awesome. Okay, last question.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite mix or production technique that you could share with the audience?
Yeah, sampling into like, in Logic it used to be Alchemy, but now they have Quick Sampler. It would be simpler in Ableton. It's basically the same thing at this point.
Yeah.
Just pulling sounds from like that. Like one of the leads in Crashing is me like just making a noise into my microphone and then I put it into a sampler. That was tight. I will say one of the biggest things if you're gonna work with vocals is it's a sidechain thing, but like sidechain your vocal to the instrumental. Because like it depends on your genre, but for the most part, if you have a vocal in a song, that's the centerpiece of your song. So you want to make sure that like no instruments are clashing with that. You want to sidechain either with like multiband or just normal sidechain, whatever. Make sure that vocal is like the thing, because that's the story, right? That's what's gonna like really bring people in. I think for most people, listening to like vocal stuff is preferred over just instrumental. not for all of us, but many of us.
Yeah.
And so really like, yeah, you can sidechain that. You can EQ things so that like the whole like bus of like instrumentals, that's another thing. Busing your stuff for CPU and other reasons. But yeah, just making sure that instrumental is like, your job as a producer is to kind of like support that story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the vocalist's job, I think, to really like tell it a little bit more forwardly. And so it's like, all right, that really needs to sit front and center. If that's clashing, if you can't hear that main vocal, like that's kind of a problem. So
yeah, so
make sure that's really there.
Keep other things out of the way of the centerpiece of the story.
Yeah, and if that's a volume thing, if it's panning, whatever it is, there's a bunch of different ways to achieve that. But sidechaining your vocal to that, sidechaining your vocal to your reverb, your delay, all that stuff is going to really help.
Yeah,
bring that space.
Yeah, 100%, man. That's a great tip.
Yeah.
Well, Digo, thanks again so much for being here today, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Where can people find you and your music online?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. Spotify is it's just Digo, Digo. Instagram is at official Digo music. That's probably the best place. I mean, Facebook is Digo. And then I have my link on all of that, so you can listen to my stuff on Spotify, Apple Music, SoundCloud, wherever you want to take a look.
Perfect. Fantastic, man. Thanks again for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
So many great tips talking with Digo today. I love the YouTube University thing. It just inspires me to want to get started, to just begin. And sometimes I think that that's the hard part. Thanks for listening to the show. If you liked it, please subscribe. And remember, as always, on the website, bedroomproducing.com, we will have links to the different things that we discussed with Digo here today. Once again, thank you for listening. Until next time, my name is Chip, and this is the Bedroom Producing Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Bedroom Producing Podcast. For more content like this, visit bedroomproducing.com.